I'm Carl King, and this is the Carl King Podcast, where we learn about music, filmmaking, and the other creative arts. To support this podcast, head over to patreon.com/carlking and join for just $1 or $5 per month. Special thank you to my Illusionist $51 level patrons, both Hank Howard III and Chewabowid. Quick shout out to my music endorsements: Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ball Strings, Toontrack, and Millennia Media. All 5 of those companies make amazing musical gear that I love to use. So let's prepare to get started. Okay, we have a short episode this week, so let's jump right into the Carl King the Human update. This has been a stressful week because, as you know, a hurricane hit my home state of Florida, and unfortunately my family back home was at the center of it. And I've been doing what I can to help and coordinate and look things up for them remotely from out in California, so I haven't had the usual time to prepare for this week's episode. I'm pretty overloaded right now, so we're going to make the best of the time here and get right into it. Just want to quickly share a couple of news items. First of all, I want to thank my creative associate Mark Borchardt for sending me a copy of his film Coven on VHS tape this week, and I appreciated his nice little handwritten note. Mark is a massive positive influence on me, both professionally and personally, and I encourage everyone to check out his work. He's got a site where he occasionally sells VHS copies of his short film, Coven, so go and visit it. That's covenfilm.square.site. Second, I received a very positive and enthusiastic review from a Patreon patron the other day. The creature known as Modiac wrote me a nice post that says, quote, Okay, the cosmic arm has been twisted. I am supporting Carl King on Patreon. You are entertaining, and I feel you have a valuable product to give to the world. Loving the podcast, movie-making lessons are pure gold, love your musical analysis, and I find myself chiming along whenever Carl King says, folks, unquote. Well, here's a special folks, just for Modiac. And thank you to everyone else who has been joining my Patreon. As I said before, every time I get a little notification email of a new member, it makes my day. Anyway, since we're short on time, let's move on to this week's film reviews and filmmaking lessons. If you're new to this, here are the rules. Number 1, I watch a movie or film and take notes as I'm watching it. And 2, I attempt to extract useful filmmaking lessons from it. And 3, I share them with you. So up first, we have Wargames from 1983, directed by John Badham, written by Walter F. Parks and Lawrence Lasker. Lasker also wrote Project X, also starring Matthew Broderick, and Helen Hunt from 1987. I looked it up, and the budget for Wargames was $12 million, but grossed $125 million worldwide, and it was nominated for 3 Academy Awards. So, it's always a surprise to me when the writers of such successful movies don't seem to go on to have more of their writing produced. But that's the speculative nightmare that is screenwriting or any kind of filmmaking. It's like, why should I hire you? What did you do? Well, I wrote a movie that made 10 times its budget. Now, can I have another job? Well, no. So, even successful directors and screenwriters might never get hired again. And I'm not so confident it's the best way for the movie industry to be structured. It's a revolving door of creative people who might get to make only one successful movie before disappearing, and replaced by new people with even less experience. I also saw that Wargames came out the same year as Return of the Jedi, and Ferris Bueller was 3 years later in 1986. So that gives you a bit of the historical context for this film. Or movie. Now check this out. This was only Matthew Broderick's second movie role, and it looks like this was the movie that was his breakthrough, because since then he has starred in somewhere around 80 films. Can you imagine that? 80 films? Well, according to the website Collider, that's actually nothing, because Danny Trejo has been in over 400. So some quick math says if you watch Danny Trejo's movies 24 hours a day and didn't sleep, it would take something like a month to get through them all. Or you could watch one of his movies every day for a year and still not get through them. I don't know what you would look like if you did something like that, but let me know if you do. Send me photos. According to Letterboxd, Danny Trejo has only been acting for about 40 years, which means he's been in 10 movies a year? Well, someone likes being in movies. Can you imagine being in that many movies? How much sweating and waiting around in a condemned building that is? But as Mark Borchardt says, you gotta make that craft services table work for you. Anyway, back to Wargames. Let's look at some more context. Both Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy were about 21 at the time. And this was 2 years before Sheedy was in Breakfast Club, 1985, by John Hughes. And Sheedy also went on to star in Short Circuit after this one, 3 years later with the same director. No Disassemble. Now, here's some story analysis. The opening scene for Wargames was expert level. And by that, I mean this. While there is dialogue happening, there is no dialogue at all to suggest what is happening or where they are. Everything we need to know is entirely visual. The only dialogue happening is nonsense small talk, like you'd have as anyone is clocking in and out of a job. But this is no ordinary day job. A less crafty screenwriter could have made the characters speak the plot. For example, they could have said, "You know, I hate being down in this top-secret missile control room in charge of launching nuclear weapons. Gosh, I hope a nuclear war doesn't break out." But instead, on the way down in the elevator, one of the guys is talking about what seems to be marijuana? Because the small talk is so vague and personal, I didn't even entirely follow it. And some of the other workers criticized them for being a bit late to work, which was also non-exposition. And I have to take a moment here to point out an unexpected detail in this scene. When the two guys are going into the control room, there's a sign on the wall. And it says, "Anyone urinating in this area will be discharged." Now, this is deep within an underground top-secret military base in maybe New Mexico? Do they not have a bathroom? Do the military personnel have to hold their pee-pee for 24 hours in there? And do people urinate right there in that spot frequently? Enough to warrant an actual sign on the wall? But think about it this way. This was a film set, so it was entirely intentional. Like, it was someone's job to go and make that sign and put it there. And it was a prominent sign. I think anyone who watches this movie probably sees it. So, whose idea was that? And why did they do it? I have no clue. Anyway, the scene ends a few minutes later on a tense moment with one guy holding a gun to the other guy's head. And we can assume what happened, or actually what didn't happen after that. But it's such a skillful opening scene from start to finish. Possibly the best scene of the whole movie. So then we meet our protagonist, played by Matthew Broderick, and there's nothing that unusual or memorable about him. He's just a clever, teenage computer hacker. And that's all we need to know, I guess. But what struck me was the detail put into Ali Sheedy's character. Either the writer or director, instead of just making her a generic female sidekick, wrote her as physically active and even athletic, which was a good contrast to the hacker nerd. I'll go through some examples of her physically active personality, because first she shows up on a moped. And I'm thinking, well, that's different. And she gives our nerdy hero a ride home from school on it. Well, that's a strong choice because it could have been a car, but they went for something different. And the second time she goes over to his house, she had been out jogging. And when we see her again, she's doing some kind of workout in leotards. I think later in the movie she mentions that she was scheduled to do some dancing on TV of some sort. Now, this was all a good bit of character detail. And if you think about it, it had nothing to do with the plot. She never uses her athleticism to solve a problem, or save the day, or move things forward in any way. It seems to have been there simply to make Ali Sheedy's character more real. So this is where I start to wonder, was this all left in there from a previous draft of the screenplay? Was her physicality originally plot-related, but now it served no purpose? Were they like, it seems cool, let's just keep it? It's possibly what happened. So, anyway, now we deal with some geographical anomalies. Both she and Matthew Broderick's character live in Seattle, Washington. So the story goes like this. After hacking into NORAD a few times, he gets arrested by the FBI outside his local 7-Eleven. But I'm wondering, why would the FBI stake out a 7-Eleven? Like, there are undercover FBI dudes all around the convenience store waiting for him. Like, pretending to read the newspaper and wearing dark sunglasses. And when they approach him, they already know his name. And even though he's probably a minor, they don't even tell his parents. They just throw him into a van and drive off. Now, I suppose maybe if the FBI had to go to his house, it would legally bog down the film since his parents would then be involved, and they'd probably take his parents in too, and that would just make the whole movie too complicated. We just have to get this guy from scene A to scene B, okay? Anyway, they bring him in for questioning, but where do they take him? They take him to one of the most important military structures in the U.S., NORAD, in Colorado, the same base he just hacked into. And by the way, NORAD is a 16-hour drive from Seattle, and I'm assuming they took him by car? It's possible they flew him there, although there's no evidence either way. And after some fun and games, he soon escapes NORAD, and he hitchhikes to Grand Junction, which is halfway across the state, 300 miles away. And he decides he needs to get from Grand Junction, Colorado, to Salem, Oregon, to try and find the inventor of the computer he hacked into. So what does he do? He calls Ali Sheedy, a 17-year-old high school girl whom he just met maybe the day before, and says, hey, can I borrow some money? Just send me some money to the airport and I'll pick it up there. And what does she do? She shows up there. She came from Seattle, and she says, oh, don't worry, it was only a 3-hour drive. But it should have been more like 16 hours. I guess that's depending on how fast you drive, but it's about 1,100 miles. And I assume that might have taken a bit longer, actually, on her moped. So then they fly all the way back west to Salem, Oregon, which would be a 16-hour drive in that direction. So I guess she leaves her moped there in Grand Junction. Then they travel by bus and ferry to a place called Goose Island, which is another few hours away. And when they get there, they find the scientist they were looking for, And his house is an outrageous set because he has tall succulents inside his living room, which is pretty hard to believe that those could survive in there. Then again, he's a scientist, so who knows what that guy is capable of? After some arguing, the scientist just doesn't want to help save the world, so the two kids leave. And since they missed the ferry, and it's now late at night, Ally Sheedy suggests they swim the 2 to 3 miles back to the Oregon mainland. Because she's super athletic. And Matthew Broderick's character admits to her that he doesn't know how to swim. Now, what does this have to do with the plot? Nothing. Maybe this stuff, like I said before, was related to a previous scene that got cut out, and maybe this was all set up in a previous version of the screenplay where Ally Sheedy would save him from drowning. I don't know. But it does end up serving as a character texture, because now we know more about Matthew Broderick's character other than he is a hacker that wears a hoodie. Aside from that detail, there's really not much else to him. So let's get back to our geographical anomalies here. As Matthew Broderick and Ally Sheedy do a kissing scene, a helicopter appears and chases them. So after some wasted time running around in circles, we learn the scientist himself is piloting the helicopter. Now, he could have just walked out into his yard and said, "Hey guys, you know what? You're right. Let's go stop a nuclear war. And hey, I can get us to NORAD. I have this helicopter." Because yeah, he has his own NORAD helicopter with the logo on it and everything. So he flies them back to NORAD again. But this time it would have been 1,300 miles. And that made me wonder, what is the range on a typical helicopter anyway? Google says it's about 250 miles. So if they flew there, they would probably have to refuel maybe 4 or 5 times, which is totally possible. Anyway, I assume he was flying them straight to NORAD in the helicopter, but then in the next scene when they arrive, it's by Jeep. So then I was curious, well, what happened in between the helicopter and the Jeep? How does one go about flying a helicopter into NORAD? Is that allowed? Because when he arrives, they didn't even seem to know he was coming. But you know what? In the end, does any of that affect the story? Does anyone watching the movie care about it? Nope, only Carl King does. So maybe the filmmaking lesson to be extracted is, when you're writing a film like this, don't get so bogged down in those sorts of tiny details. Unless you really want to. Now, when I write my screenplays, I really do try to get all of those things exact. I worry about the physics and how long it takes to get from one location to another, and can an apocalyptoraptor really run as fast as a plane? I might pick up on more logical errors and implausibilities, but I'm sure I miss some of them too. As a writer, it can give you some relief to work in these broad strokes, and maybe it doesn't matter if you get all the little geographical details correct, because it's just a story. That is, unless those details really stand out as implausible or straight up impossible. As long as those sorts of details stay below the conscious threshold, the illusion of the film is maintained. But here's something I appreciated. The ending has a moral of the story, that nuclear war is unwinnable, and that was a big statement to make back in 1983. So I gave this movie 5 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd. Up next, we have The Thing from 1982, starring Wilford Brimley, who plays the role of a doctor. And this was perhaps the start of his long career in the field of medicine. The Thing was directed by John Carpenter with a screenplay by Bill Lancaster, who also wrote some of the Bad News Bears movies and nothing else. If that doesn't tell you how speculative this business is, I don't know what will. The Thing is actually based on a 1938 novella called Who Goes There? And the first movie based on it was The Thing from Another World in 1951. Now, here's something that surprised me. This movie came out in 1982, but they started development for this version in the mid-70s. That's a long time. It went through several writers and directors before landing in the hands of John Carpenter. And for reference, this movie came out after Escape from New York, which was in 1981, the year before. Now, this movie opened on the same day as Blade Runner, and it performed so poorly that, according to Wikipedia, John Carpenter lost his job as director of what would be his next film, Firestarter, and Universal bought out his multiple film contract. In other words, they paid him money so he would stop making movies for them. But it turned out Firestarter didn't do too great without him either. And here's what's hard for me to accept. That one of the most influential directors in the world, having created so many iconic films, was considered a failure at almost every step. And maybe it shows how short-sighted the film studios are, or how short-sighted everyone is. Because his career is like a bunch of box office bombs in a row that add up to a legend. John Carpenter has directed 24 films now. The latest was in 2010 called The Ward, starring everyone's favorite woman, Amber Heard. Now, John Carpenter was 62 at the time he directed The Ward, and it, of course, guess what? It bombed. It made only half of its budget back. Now, is there some kind of rule that John Carpenter's films will only make exactly half of their budget back? Is it like a curse? Or some kind of mathematical absolute? To balance out the universe, is there a director out there whose films always make exactly double of their budget back? My guess is this. Maybe his films only bomb because they're being marketed as mainstream films. Force-fed to large audiences, rather than cult films for the true fans, because his works are beloved within the horror genre. And that actually seems to be why Carpenter quit making major films. Okay, so back to The Thing. Oddly enough, on Letterboxd, The Thing comes up as the most popular of John Carpenter's films, even above Halloween, which somehow comes in second. And I would have thought Halloween would be 1, and maybe Big Trouble in Little China would be 2. But hey, the snobby film people have spoken. So here we go. Let's do some analysis. This is another film with 2 minutes of white credits over black and some music. 2 whole minutes. Now, I wonder, how expensive is it in terms of attention to fill the first 2 minutes of a film? Well, if you take the film's entire budget, which was $15 million, and divide it by the total running time of 109 minutes, those opening credits were worth about $275,000 in 1982, and that would be $844,000 in 2022 today. So that's almost $500,000 a minute. Well, no wonder movies spend so little time on simple opening and end credits these days. But also, maybe you can get away with that kind of thing when people are already in their seats in a theater to see a horror movie in the 80s. But in these times of streaming, how many people would already be bored and click away? I know on YouTube, no one would have the patience. The movie would need to get to it in 30 seconds, and if not 10 seconds, because otherwise the audience is long gone. And this film reminds me a bit of The Shining from 1980, only 2 years earlier. When I looked that up, I was surprised The Shining was from 1980. I would have never thought of The Shining as technically an 80s movie. I honestly assumed this whole time that it was from the 60s or 70s. And that shows you how little I know. But that's what we're here for, to learn. And some of us, like me, will never learn. Anyway, the reason I bring up The Shining This is another spooky film about people in an isolated, snowy location trying to entertain themselves and kind of losing their minds. They're pretty much doing nothing. But then the story creates intrigue with that husky. What's the deal with that? Is the husky the thing? Or is the guy in the helicopter chasing the husky and shooting at it the thing? Well, we don't know. This is a slow movie. 17 minutes in, and we still don't know the premise of what's going on. We know that something is up, and a guy in a helicopter went crazy. There's also a flying saucer in the opening first shot. What was that about? Are we going to see aliens here, or... And speaking of aliens, this actually reminds me of Alien from 1979 by Ridley Scott. In the meantime, this film has naturalistic acting, and the characters are constantly drinking. It's kind of like Portland. And there's so little going on that by the middle of the movie, about an hour in, I started to check out. Now, I'm not caring about the story at all, and you know why? Because I think once we know it's an alien that's infecting and trying to kill everyone, it stops being a film and becomes a video game. And once we know the stakes, can the filmmaker sustain the story? In order to do that, I think the novelty and the surprise has to increase. It can't just be characters running from a bad guy, which is what so many horror movies turn into. Now, I'm not interested in a clearly defined field with two teams like football. What I like to see are more twists and mysteries. Keep surprising me with unexpected turns, not just escalation of the same thing with bigger and bigger explosions. Because otherwise, we pretty much know what's going to happen. The good guy will probably win. Aha, but good news. This story has an ambiguous ending, which is just two guys staring at each other, and we don't know which one of them is the thing. I like that Kurt Russell said that scene ends on the basic theme of the film, which is paranoia, and that's some good stuff. So the filmmaking lessons to extract might be, number one, keep the story fresh and surprising beyond the beginning of the third act. You've got to keep us guessing. Don't just make us watch sports. And two, it's possible to have a very long and successful directing career, even if many of your films quote-unquote fail. That is, if you're John Carpenter. Well, my own personal opinion, I didn't emotionally enjoy this film a whole lot. But it's a classic, and it did give me a lot to think about. So, just because I didn't exactly like it, I still think it's good, so I gave it 5 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd. And now for the album of the week. This week's album of the week is Vi Piano Reductions Volume 1. Folks, how many of these albums of the week can I do before I cover all of my favorites? Well, this album has got to be at least in my top 5. There's really nothing like it, so it has to occupy one of those top spots. Maybe it's number 4. Let's see. Steve Vai's Passion and Warfare is number 1 permanently, and nothing can dislodge it. Mr. Bungle's first album is probably number 2, because I can't imagine a world in which I didn't hear that record. But it's difficult to say whether Steve Vai's Flexible needs to be number 3 or number 2, honestly. Or maybe Steve Vai's Sex and Religion should be number 3. Anyway, Vi Piano Reductions is right up there with those necessary albums. My point is, if we had to wipe out all of the albums from existence and only save 5, this would have to be one of them. Maybe someday I will get the opportunity to do a Thanos reboot on all music, in which case I should probably choose a bunch of Stravinsky and John Williams and be done with it. But that tells you how much I love this record. I actually wrote to both Steve Vai and Mike Keneally in December 2006, and told them they should stop making all other music and commit themselves to making more of this material. But that's another story. Imagine a bunch of Steve Vai compositions turned into solo piano pieces performed by Mike Keneally. And although it's called reductions, they are far from being reductions. They are truly expansions. Now, it's a bit confusing whether the official artist on the album is Mike Keneally or Steve Vai, but if you're trying to find it, try both of those. It comes up as Mike Keneally on Apple Music, but it's listed as Steve Vai on Spotify. Either way, I'd like to draw your attention to the rendition of the piece called Pig, a song that originally appeared on the Sex and Religion album. You know, the one that Devin Townsend originally sang on. So if you listen to nothing else on this record, go and listen to Pig. It is a dissonant, energetic, somewhat atonal storm of unusual melodies and syncopations. It's very asymmetrical and very 20th century. Very fun. And I need to tell you this because I know how worried you are about breaking the rules. There are no headphones required this time. Only for this week, you can listen through regular speakers. Because Vai Piano Reductions is only one instrument, acoustic piano, and it will come through just fine on pretty much any device. By the way, there is a Volume 2 in this series performed by a different pianist named Miho Arai, and it is superbly done. But it didn't strike me personally like the Keneally tracks did. Now, if someone told me that it was Keneally, I might not know the difference. It's probably just my own personal interest in the work of Mike Keneally. And anyway, I'm sure that most people who enjoy Volume 1 will also enjoy Volume 2. And if you ever run into those guys, Vai or Keneally, tell them you agree with Carl King. More piano albums, okay? Okay. And that is the end of this episode of the Carl King Podcast. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere else you listen to these dang podcasts. And support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. And as always, special thanks to my $51 a month patrons at the Special Illusionist level, Chewabode and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for listening. And as I always say, folks. Okay, I think I got it.